All right. Hello, welcome to the ASP.NET Community Stand-Up. I am very happy to be rejoined by Safia.
Hi, everyone.
I'm getting flashbacks to the Blazor stand-ups from
Yeah.
days of old. Awesome.
From way back when, yeah.
Yep. So today we're going to be talking about OpenAPI updates in .NET 9. It feels like you're all over the place in ASP.NET, Safia. You're working on so many things.
Yeah, I like to keep it interesting. So I jump around between different areas, but OpenAPI is actually something that has been an area of focus or ownership for me for probably like 3 years now.
Oh, wow.
Basically since I started working on minimal APIs. So I have a lot of history and passion for the space.
Awesome. Okay, before jumping to our community links, I got to just shout out to, okay, we got Brazil, Nepal, India, and Korea all saying hi. So I just love that. Our global community all saying hi around the world.
Yeah.
Okay, let's jump into some community links, and then we will hop over to all the OpenAPI stuff. I will share this in the comments. It's also in the description. And so let's, and I will put us in, let's do this format. Okay, so first of all, we have build was last week. So many great things going on there. One way to get to these is you can click on these view session and you can see these are all posted. So a lot of great stuff there. Another thing is we have a roll-up blog post. This is kind of huge. James went crazy putting all the stuff together with all the team members chiming in. So this is all the stuff, all the different things across the ecosystem. So what we announced and covered at Build. So this kind of has all the links and everything in depth, including, of course, Aspire. We also have a YouTube playlist. So this YouTube playlist has all the YouTube videos for .NET at Build, including a bunch of, there were some like smaller on-demand videos that went deep that weren't live at Build. So even if you watched all the live sessions, there's some additional ones here, which are great. We have the release of Aspire. So Damien explains all the stuff, what we released at Build, the GA, and what's in there. So exciting stuff. There's also, with Aspire, we have some new learning, some things in Microsoft Learn, some Learn modules, and some getting started videos. So those are also listed. All right. We've got this cool C# 12 series that David Pine's been doing. So he did one on primary constructors, and then this is on refactoring with collection expressions. And then some more of these to come. I love the way David writes. These are so fun, and just going through and explaining them and making it kind of fun to get used to using some of these new things. I'm still wrapping my head around it. So it's nice to see these in context. Okay, just a nice feature here. The .NET API docs now link directly to source code. So this is a nice little feature you may not notice. So this is directly in the API docs. You can just click and it'll take you right into the source code. So, and what's neat too is the explanation of how they're actually built. So using Roslyn and the go-to definition functionality and integrating that into docs. I'm talking fast because I want to give you plenty of OpenAPI time.
No, you're good. As a total nerd for source code, I'm so glad that these source links are coming to the API docs.
Right? Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan. It's also great too when Microsoft Teams explain how they're writing production code using .NET. So it's always cool to see, like, here's how we did it. Here's some things we ran into, that sort of stuff. So we had Mike Kistler on .NET Community Stand-Up recently, and he was talking about what's new in Orleans. So this is a blog post that kind of sums that up. So notes on all the new things in Orleans. Okay, community post here. Matthew on the Engine blog. So I had seen some of these posts, but I hadn't realized this is a huge series. This is, I think, at least 15 talking about JSON schema patterns in .NET, all kinds of stuff. And they're using this at work at Engine, but it's just great to see these. These are, and you can see the scroll bar here. These are all long posts. So this is just a huge amount of documentation, and things like working with tensors, working with tuples, that sort of stuff. So. Okay, some neat stuff on NuGet. So first of all, the C# dev kit continuing to add really cool functionality. So this is in C# dev kit now. There's things for like updating and removing NuGet packages. So nice to see those included. I've been bouncing back and forth. I use full Visual Studio for a lot of development, but it's great to use VS Code as well, and so it's nice to see some of these features appearing there.
Yeah, I love it as a diehard VS Code user of several years, even before the C# dev kit. So
yeah, and it's you could back in the day with VS Code, like it was great, and then I was spending so much time popping into the console, and doing a lot of stuff, or like directly editing C# or my CS proj files, and it's nice to just have some of those convenience things.
Yeah, I'm obsessed with the Test Explorer.
Oh yeah. And even just simple things like Solution Explorer and the project templates and file templates. It's like, oh man, I've been missing these.
Yeah.
Cool. Let me see. Also from NuGet, so a new release of NuGet, and this one has some new .NET NuGet config command. So that's handy for managing. Nice to not need to kind of bounce back and forth between the different commands, and also for automation if you need that. Okay, so we're shifting into the OpenAPI section, and one thing on this, we had I saw a community post from Khalid Abu Hakma, and here he was, he talked about a refactoring thing where he was kind of going through, and he had kind of a simple API, and then he refactored it to a local function, and did a few things, and then all of a sudden he saw that he now was getting this error that he had basically stripped out his API definition, and so he'd turned the method into a request delegate, and the solution in his case was he needed to explicitly cast it back to a delegate. So I'm not sure. I don't know how common this is to run into this sort of issue, but I thought this was interesting.
Yeah, it's actually pretty common. There's a bug on the ASP.NET Core repo about it. And if folks want to get into the nitty gritty of why this happens and our thoughts on how to fix it, pop a question in the chat and I'd be happy to ramble about it a bit.
Awesome. Okay. Well, I've only got 2 more links, and these are the ones you shared with me, and these are on the content you're going to be covering here.
Yeah.
So this is your blog post, and then your demo repo. So for people asking, is the code available and all that, so that you don't need to ask that because there it is.
Yeah.
And I'm going to turn it over to you. So I will set us up over here, and I'll add you to the stage, and there you go.
Cool. All right. Everyone can see my slides. As John just mentioned, everything that I presented is on GitHub, and we'll be sharing a link out to the repo in case you want to take a look at some of that stuff later. And then as part of this, it's also linked in the repo that we'll share. I did write a little bit of like a deep dive blog post into how OpenAPI support is implemented in .NET 9. So if you're interested in kind of getting a behind the scenes understanding of how it works, that blog post is a great place to start. I'll also be diving a little bit into it here as part of this talk. Speaking about what I'll be covering in this presentation, I've got a rough agenda outlined here for us. So the first thing I want to do is kind of just talk a little bit about what we're doing, what is coming in .NET 9, what is actually the scope of OpenAPI work that we are going to be producing. And then I want to talk a little bit about some of the APIs that we're providing as part of our updates to the Microsoft.ASPNETCore OpenAPI package, talk a little bit about all of the customization options that are available. And then obviously one of the most important things about OpenAPI is that it is a it's a specification, it's a standard. And it being a standard means that there's a wide variety of tooling that builds up on it. So we're going to talk a little bit about how integration with third-party tools works. And then we're going to go into a little bit of an overview of the implementation. I always like to take people behind the scenes on how stuff works. I mentioned earlier, this is an area that I've been dabbling in for about 3 years now, since .NET 6. So wanted to share a little bit about how things work behind the scenes. And this you'll kind of get a deeper understanding for in the blog post that I mentioned earlier. The second to last point we'll cover is all about schemas. And this is specifically talking about JSON schemas. OpenAPI and JSON schema have a pretty close relationship with each other. There's all sorts of interesting things to dive into when we think about JSON schema, whether it's recursive types and how they should be represented in schemas, polymorphic types, enums, form-based inputs, all a variety of things. So I want to take you behind the scenes a little bit about some of the ways that we are planning on supporting all of those things. And then last but not least, I think this is just the beginning of this work. I think there's lots of interesting things for us to explore in this space to make it a really first-class experience as far as code-first OpenAPI support in ASP.NET Core. So I want to talk a little bit about what we're planning on doing for .NET 9, and then some of the things that I would love to pursue in .NET 10 and beyond to keep making this experience super great. And then as I'm presenting, I'll pause a little bit for questions. I'll try and take questions that are relevant to what I just covered. And then at the end, I'll do the random grab bag of everything else. Cool. Okay, so we know where we're going. We've got like 45 minutes together to party. So let's get started with it. So first things first is what is coming exactly in .NET 9. And the best way to explain it is to explain what we are not doing in .NET 9. This is a rough bullet list of things that we're not planning on including in the framework or any of the packages as part of this work. There's no client or server code generation. If you're familiar with tools like NSWAG's client generation or Kyoto, even OpenAPI has its own C# based client generation. We are not doing anything similar to that. So that's one thing we're not doing. Another thing that you might have heard of, and we'll talk a little bit about, is that there's no OpenAPI UI in the framework. So you might be familiar with tools like Swagger UI or Redoc that allow you to have a visual UI of what is in your OpenAPI document. That's not being shipped in the framework at all. There's no OpenAPI-based spec testing. So there are tools out there in the ecosystem that allow you to take an OpenAPI file and take an API implementation and then verify that the API implementation is behaving with the expectations that have been laid out in the OpenAPI file. Not doing that either. Now you're probably sitting here and you're like, okay, well, then what the heck are you doing? And what we are doing is code-first OpenAPI documentation generation. So the idea is that we're going to take an API. It can be either a minimal API or a controller-based API in MVC. We're going to support certain kinds of customizations, and we're going to generate an OpenAPI representation of that backing API. And I think a kind of unique goal for this work, and it follows with some of the stuff that we started doing in .NET 8, is that this library or the support here is going to be native AOT friendly, at least for minimal APIs, because that's where a lot of our native AOT efforts have been focused. So that's kind of the gist of what we're planning on doing. And it seems like a pretty small amount of scope, but I've always described this as do one thing and do it really well, and then allow people to integrate with the entirety of the OpenAPI ecosystem.
So before going on, there was one. There's a question: is there any reason why client generation isn't in the plans? And then while mentioning that, is there I mean, I'm guessing there's scope and availability, but then there's also what you want to focus on, or if the open source community covers things already or whatever.
Yeah.
Like, so this one is specific to client generation, but just any of the others, like, do you want to explain any why you've decided, or, why the focus?
Yeah. I think with regards to client generation in particular, it's one of those things where we want to support some of the existing tooling that is already out there. So I mentioned NSWAG. Those of you who are familiar might know that there is a lot of first-class integrations with NSWAG's client gen in both Visual Studio and in ASP.NET Core. We want to take those integrations that we provide and make them more flexible to other code generators. Kyoto is one that we have explored in the past. I know that is kind of emerging as a popular one. I think GitHub is actually using it for their client SDKs. So for some of those things, it's like good client generators are a hard problem to solve. And if there's already somebody that's doing it really well, we want to provide the integration point for it in the framework, as opposed to taking on the burden of having to do that work as well, if not better. And then the same goes for things like UI frameworks and OpenAPI based spec testing. There's a ton of great tooling that exists, and we'll dive into it a bit later. But the idea is to enable those integrations so that you can take advantage of all those tools and kind of do one thing and do it really well.
So, and I'm guessing you may be going into this later too, but you did bring up, open source things. And so there are questions about, like, what about contributing to Swashbuckle and other things? And then, you mentioned like Swagger and NSWAG, are what we building integrating with that and that sort of thing.
Yeah. As far as contributions to existing tools, when we had Swashbuckle in the templates, this is one of the changes that's coming in .NET 9. Swashbuckle is being removed from the default ASP.NET Core templates. It still exists as a library that you can use independently. It's actually back to being maintained now. It was out of maintenance for a little bit, but it's got active maintainership now. So those libraries will still exist. We have contributed to Swashbuckle in the past. In .NET 6, when we shipped minimal APIs, we did a bunch of work to add support for the new minimal host model in Swashbuckle. We also did some work in .NET 7 when we introduced the with OpenAPI extension method. So we've been contributing in the past, but the goal here, and I think what's interesting for me, having dabbled in this space, is bringing that document generation, that representation of what your API looks like, a little bit closer to the framework where that's doing the actual model binding, that's doing the actual response generation, has a little bit more insight into how things are behaving. So I think there's a big value prop in having the way you represent an API live closer to where the API is actually behaving.
Okay. So then if I'm hearing right, like the goal is as the framework developer, documenting what you're building, and then providing that information in a standard way that other libraries that kind of work with the open standards can then expose that as UI or clients or other things.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And since there's lots of curiosity about integrations, I want to call out that this is something that I've spent a fair bit of time writing about in the documentation. So in the docs, we talk about integrating with things like Swagger UI, Scalar UI, which we'll talk about later in this presentation, and linting tools. As folks are curious about specific integrations, this is something where I'd love for us to be like writing blog posts or just authoring content. But really the power is it's a spec, and if you can meet the standards of the spec, you can integrate with anything.
Awesome. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
All right. Awesome. That was a good point to pause for questions. The next thing I wanted to talk about is how you actually use the package. So we shipped all of these new APIs in Preview 4. So if you want to take advantage of it, .NET add package, Microsoft.ASPNETCore Core OpenAPI pre-release, or just putting in the Preview 4 version from the NuGet feed will get you what you need. And then the new APIs are really twofold, and I've highlighted them in the comments here. There's a new extension method on iServer service collection called add OpenAPI. It does what it says on the tin. It registers into your DI container all of the different services that are required for OpenAPI document generation. As a little bit of a inside look at this, we take big advantage of keyed DI in the implementation for this API. So the keyed DI feature that's shipped in .NET 8.
Yeah.
It's powering a lot of this stuff under the hood with respect to being able to represent multiple documents within a given application. And then there's map OpenAPI. You call this method and it will register an endpoint on your application that will present the actual OpenAPI document as JSON. One of the things I want to call out here is that this is not a middleware. It's an endpoint, which means that you can use a lot of the endpoint metadata, endpoint extension methods that are available with this endpoint. So what do I mean by that? You can enable authorization checks on the endpoint by calling require authorization. That is documented in the docs that we'll link to later. You can enable caching of the generated OpenAPI document using output caching. So you can start to kind of use any of the features that are available on minimal API endpoints on this OpenAPI endpoint, which I think is kind of a cool thing to call out. So this is the code and sample here, and I have a screenshot of what it looks like when you actually run it and visit the minimal API endpoint. But we can also just run it real quick. Here's the code. You'll find this in the repo. I've got kind of regions to define different parts of the sample. This is our basic sample with @OpenAPI and .NET Build, and I'm going to run it behind the scenes in my terminal window that you can't see in the background, and we'll be able to take a look at what's generated in a bit, assuming my build works really fast. That's always it's always something you have to deal with when you're oh, that's fun. And something is running. Sorry.
If it's slow, I've got there's a few questions. If not, we can.
Yeah, it's actually not slow. It's I think I have an instance of it running, but it's not the one I want. But I'm just going to kill it in the background and then do it again. You can't see what I'm doing, so it's not interesting. But I just found the process ID for the process that was listening on the port that I needed and killed it. Magic. I like that. Okay, so here it is. Visited my endpoint. I can see it's just a hello world. So I get the super basic, it's a single endpoint supports GET requests and produces a 200 response. That's just the string text that we're looking for. Not very interesting, but this is the beginnings of something great.
I'll trust you.
One of the things that I wanted to call out is that in addition to being able to view the generated OpenAPI file via an endpoint that is running on your application server, another really common integration point is being able to generate those OpenAPI files at build time. And this is something really useful if you're doing things like trying to generate OpenAPI files and CI so that you can lint them, or maybe you're uploading them to some repository, or you're trying to integrate with like Azure API management or other API management services. And support for build time document generation is actually kind of lit up for all of this using an existing package that has been around since like 3.1. The problem with this package is it's like terribly named, but we can't change that now, so we must live with our choices. It's called Microsoft Extensions API Description .server. And this package is basically a set of MS Build tasks and properties, and then a bundled command line tool that will launch your application host, resolve a marker service that supports OpenAPI file generation, call it at build time, and then spit out the generated OpenAPI files to disk. And so what happens is as soon as you install this package using a command like this, what you'll see is that in your intermediary output directory, you'll have your project name or your app name .json stored on disk. And this is the exact same thing that was present in my OpenAPI endpoint that I just showed you.
Okay.
So this isn't anything, the package itself is not new. We've just kind of implemented the marker interface that it looks for as part of this work, but nothing much outside of that. So that is kind of the basics of it. I will pause for any questions before I dive into the next portion, which is about UI.
Okay, let's see. Okay, so a question here. I think this was about Swashbuckle. This is saying, here, I'll put this here because so it was removed from the .NET 9 template, but I can still use them as I use today. So the NuGet packages.
Yep,
right?
correct. You can continue to use it. If you have been using it, the new maintenance team has just released new versions of the package. So I would recommend upgrading to the new version so you can take on some bug fixes and improvements in that. But yes, it still exists. You can still use it. If you have been successful using it, you can continue to do so.
Cool. Let me see. Okay. When I looked into it, using JOT authentication wasn't straightforward with Swashbuckle. Will there be something to add to security aspects in the spec?
Yeah, this is a great question. And this actually gets into something that I've prototyped or experimented with in the past. So OpenAPI has the concept of security schemes and definitions where you can outline what kinds of security configuration your app has. Is it OAuth? Is it JOT-based? I think there's a couple of other categories. And by default, we won't do anything to automatically generate those security definitions for you. There will be extension APIs that you can use to write them yourselves, similar to what you would do in Swashbuckle. One of the things that makes it a little bit difficult to automatically do that is the fact that ASP.NETCore's like authentication configuration is not very introspectable. So I did do some prototyping in the past to see what would it look like if the auth layer in ASP.NET Core could document itself, and then we could query what it documents and then represent it in OpenAPI. It'll take a little bit of work. I was successful with my prototyping for some things, but it's not something we're pursuing in .NET 9. We might pick it up in the future. It's also one of those things where, because it's security related, you really have to get it right if you're going to do something automatically. So unfortunately for now, it's going to have to be manual for the foreseeable future.
Okay, cool. Let me see. Will there be support for generating several OpenAPI doc file scenarios with Azure API Management Service hosting several groupings of API endpoints? Today, we generate 2 separate files.
Yes, there will be support for multiple files, and I'll show that in just a little bit. We've also been working to make sure that the Visual Studio integration experience, if you're publishing with Azure App Service and uploading to APIM, that works with all this new stuff. So I've been working with folks on the Visual Studio team to make sure all that is buttoned up nicely. So yes, those things are, and groupings are supported. So yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Apart from properties generated from annotation and XML docs, will you be providing multi-example support for request response examples? Currently, we use Swashbuckle ASP.NET Core filters.
Good question. Outside of annotation and XML documentation, there's not a plan to provide like super first-class support for having multiple examples. You'd have to kind of, similar to with schema filters or operation filters, you'd have to manually write out those examples yourself. So unfortunately, nothing interesting in that area, but please do file an issue. I'd love to know what the pain points are currently in the API to see if maybe there's some like creative problem solving I could do there.
Okay. And it does sound like they're using Swashbuckle ASP.NET Core filters, so that is a solution, if that works. Does compile time doc runner generation run through program CS? If so, how do you detect that and avoid doing extra work? I was wondering about that too, with like any potential side effects or things.
Yeah. It's super fun. So yes, it does run through program CS. It kind of has to, because there's some interesting conversations on GitHub I've had with people about using source generators to generate OpenAPI files at build time, instead of doing all of the stuff where we actually like run your app code or your app host to get the OpenAPI document. Source generators don't really work as a solution because of the accuracy factor. There are just certain aspects of it that you have to run the app in order to be able to see, particularly for MVC, where we really haven't like formalized what source generation for MVC looks like. We've done it for minimal APIs with RGG, but MVC is like it uses a lot of reflection. It's kind of scary.
So many things now, as I look back at MVC, it's like, oh, there's filters and all these things, and you can. And now it's like, oh my gosh, so much of it, like you're saying, it's all reflection.
Yes, it makes it really difficult. Now, the second part of your question is a good one. There's not really a great way to detect that your app host is being launched from the OpenAPI like build time invoker. This is something I've been noodling on though, and it's spoiler alert, it's in one of the next steps items. Like I'd like to figure out how to work towards making this experience better, because I mentioned it's been around for a while. It hasn't really changed. So yes, it does run through program CS. I hope to make it a little bit easier to detect it via some flag or some check, so that people can avoid like connecting to their like actual database or what have you.
Yeah, I've wondered about that too, with like, I don't know, even like there's other things that do this too, like there's you have scaffolding or things like that, right? Where like it has to execute some stuff in program CS, and it's like, I'm a little scared by that. So
MVC testing is the other one that does this
right.
for integration testing, although it has some niceties for dealing with that. But yes, Mizzard, this is not a problem that has been disregarded. I'm hoping that maybe for .NET 9, I can squeeze out an interesting solution or make progress in the area. But yeah.
Okay, cool. 2 more questions, and then I'll let you get going. Let me see. How can you tag endpoints to be part of a specific JSON file?
Good question. I'm going to talk about it in a little bit, but there is an API in the options configuration for your OpenAPI service that allows you to denote what kinds of endpoints should be included. And then endpoint group name metadata is kind of the default check that we'll use. So you'll be able to see some code for that in just a bit.
Let me see. Okay, last question here. Is there a way to generate OpenAPI faster at build time when a project is huge and the build's taking forever?
Oh yeah, it's the same thing we were kind of just talking about. If your startup logic is doing a lot of things, cost is going to get passed to your build, because we're having to actually run your app at startup. So unfortunately not, but one of those things where if we pass a flag that allows you to kind of incrementally mock out certain things, that would help with that process.
Okay, I guess I lied, because I want to take 2 more quick questions, but I think they're quick. Is this feature .NET 9 and forward only?
Yes.
Okay. And last one, can you walk us through technical implementation of this?
I can, and there's also the blog post that we talked about earlier, which you can read, and it's got all of the like nitty-gritty behind the scenes of it.
Awesome. Okay, I am done interrupting, and back to you.
No, you're good. That's exactly what I wanted. Okay, so what about UI? I mentioned earlier, we're not shipping support for any UI out of the box. If you are used to working with Swashbuckle or NSWAG, this is probably going to be the biggest kind of delta for you. You will press F5 and there will be nothing to look at. This is a very intentional decision, and we did put a lot of thinking into it. One of the reasons, at least, is that there are quite a few OpenAPI UI providers that exist out there. Swagger UI is probably the most popular, but it's just one of them. Redoc is another one. Scalar is the third icon that I have up there. Scalar has a kind of a special place in my heart that we'll talk about. So there's a variety of third-party options. We didn't want to take the opinion on what is the one right UI that we should include in the box. And going back to that point about doing one thing and doing it really well, we want to integrate well with the existing tools that are out there. The other thing is we want to be careful about including some of these UI-based testing tools in production, particularly Swagger. If you are not careful about how you are handling your OAuth config in Swagger UI, and I see somebody asked a question in that, if you're not careful about how you're handling your OAuth config in Swagger UI, you can unintentionally leak OAuth client IDs and secrets to the UI. Swagger UI has a warning about this in their documentation, but it can be a little bit hard to find if you're not careful. Our templates by default in .NET 8 and prior to only use the UI in development. It's kind of another reason we really view the UI as development time experience. There are ones that work just for static doc-based testing, but that's something you really want to be thoughtful about how you want to document your API in production if you're somebody like a GitHub or a Stripe or what have you.
Yeah, I think it, like you mentioned tokens, but also just if you accidentally have maybe one of your APIs is, I mean, it's basically like a CRUD interface to your back end almost, right? So you got to be really careful.
Yeah, totally. So this is in the docs, but really quickly, I want to share what it looks like to add support for this in your framework. And the first thing I want to talk about is Swagger UI, if you're already familiar with that. So this is the code sample for using Swagger UI as bundled in the Swashbuckle ASP.NET Core Swagger UI package. What's really cool about Swashbuckle is that their Swagger UI bundle is split out into a separate NuGet package. And if I pop open my CS proj here, you can see I've included it as a package reference in my project. So you can include just the Swagger UI, and then you can configure it to point to the endpoint that the built-in OpenAPI document generation produces, which is OpenAPI/document-name.json. So if I go behind the scenes and I run this app, what I'll be able to do is view the Swagger UI that's produced by Swashbuckle, but I will be using the OpenAPI document that's generated by ASP.NET Core. So you can like interrupt the two really nicely. Here it is. So here's my same page that I was showing you earlier. This is the generated file, but if I go to Swagger / I think it's index.html, I can view the Swagger UI associated with it. And again, this is a one-time process. Once I set this up, I don't have to do it again. And the Swagger UI package does a bulk of the work for me. Okay, now I get to talk about something that I think is super fun about OpenAPI and it being a spec, is that we can integrate with so many cool third-party tools. So have you heard of Scalar, John?
I have not. I'm very interested.
Okay, let me put you on this because it's pretty cool. So I'm going to just pop open my Scalar code sample and then expand it here. So Scalar is another OpenAPI UI tool, similar to Swagger UI or Redoc, except I think it's so much cooler. It just looks a little bit more modern. Sorry, no hate to Swagger UI, but I think some of the aesthetics leave something to be desired. But Scalar exists.
I've read articles like you can redesign the Swagger UI, like you can change how it looks.
Yes, you can do all sorts of CSS on it. I'm sorry to have hate for the UI, but I'll show you Scalar and you'll just see how beautiful it is. So this is Scalar. And I want to shout out somebody on the GitHub who brought this to my attention. Okay, so this is what Scalar UI looks like, and this is for the same OpenAPI document that I was just looking at. And you can see it's got a little bit of a different aesthetic, same document, different UI. What's really cool about this is that we actually collaborated with the Scalar team to produce a .NET package on NuGet to provide this map Scalar API reference, similar to use Scalar or use Swagger UI that Swashbuckle does. And so the Scalar team now has kind of a .NET package similar to what they do with or what we have with Swagger UI via Swashbuckle. Again, I'm only enabling this in development. I always think that's a prudent option to do with any of these. And obviously, you still want to be cautious about reading the documentations for Scalar, making sure that you've configured it correctly with all of the options that are available. But yeah, I think this is super fun. Thanks to the Scalar team, I'll give them another shout out. I think it's really cool that we can kind of just partner on stuff by virtue of it being OpenAPI inside. And this is stuff that I would love to see us doing more of, and I want to do more of with this OpenAPI support. So if there is like a third-party UI tool or a testing tool or anything like that, and you're like, gosh, I wish they really had a sample for .NET, or I tried using it with .NET and it just kind of like sucked. You can let me know, and I'm happy to make that experience better.
Cool.
Okay, I can pause for questions. I have so much more content, and we're
so we can go a little bit long.
Yes.
Also, there are a few questions just in general. So Fool Snabble was asking, like, they were told not to ship Swagger UI in production, and if there may be any docs or things about that. I know you like we worked on this internally. You've been working on the docs, making sure now that we only turn on Swagger UI in development. I mean, my understanding, the guidance is you can turn it on in production, but you're responsible for verifying that authentication and that you're not exposing anything you shouldn't.
And being careful about, if you just want static doc space, like turn off the try it out experience in Swagger UI. There are some CVEs that are open on Swagger, so you want to be careful about that as well. But it's generally one of those things where it's a really powerful tool in development when you can, basically get like a free kind of API testing tool locally. Do you really want that in your production environment? No. So make sure you're cautious about how you're configuring it in production. And one of the things that we really saw is sometimes people are not careful about how they have stuff configured in production versus development, especially for something like Swagger UI that's not like a database or an actual resource of your app. So just exercising caution in that area in general.
So we're basically required, like, it's your code, you can make your decisions with it, but it should be a thoughtful decision. It shouldn't be like, oops, I accidentally pushed Swagger UI to production.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Okay. I think that's just the other thing is people are, calling out the love for Scalar, so they're happy about that. This is interesting, FedEx and UPS. So that's neat. Johan's saying that they've enabled that in service defaults, which is cool. And then a question here on, can you use both Scalar and Swagger UI?
You could have them in the same API. They register on different endpoints, but they can point to the same backing OpenAPI file. So yeah.
Okay. Cool. Well, I guess that's it. That's great. And then you mentioned Redoc. Is it just another UI kind of?
Yes, it is. I didn't show it in my samples, but I believe Swashbuckle has a package for it, and Swag also exposes an API for it. And the other thing is a lot of these are just like HTML pages with CSS and JavaScript that have config that points to the JSON file. So you can also roll your own out pretty easily.
Very cool. Okay.
I saw a question that I would like to ramble about. I think our biggest problem with Swagger UI is the generation of the OpenAPI takes 1 minute of CPU time. So I don't know how big your API is, but we have done a ton of benchmarking for the built-in OpenAPI support. You can find the benchmarks on the ASP.NET Core repo. I think we've done them for like 10, 100, and 1,000 endpoints. It scales. It could probably scale further, but benchmarking and profiling is something that we spent time on, or I spent time on as part of this work. So I hope that in addition to all of the goodness that you see, perf is also accounted for. If it's not, let me know. If you like have 20 bajillion endpoints in your app, and that causes things to like keel over, that'd be interesting to know. But yeah, perf has been accounted for.
Cool. All right, I think that's all the questions. So
okay. Cool. All right. So the next portion of the talk is really talking about customizations that are available. One of the things that was asked earlier is, how do you manage multiple docs in the same app? And I talked a little bit earlier about how prominent key DI is in this feature set. And we could see that a little bit if we jump into our multi-doc sample. So let me pop in my define here, and we'll expand our multi-doc sample. Okay, so this is the multi-doc sample. What I have here is 2 minimal API endpoints. Both of these endpoints have a group name defined. One is public, one is internal. I'm registering some APIs on them. And I have registered my add OpenAPI call 2 distinct times with the group names that I have used. So I've got an internal document and a public document. And if we pop into my browser, what is it? Localhost 5175. I think that's it. And I'm going to go ahead. I don't think you could see it really well because of the Zoom, but I'm visiting OpenAPI/document name. So OpenAPI internal.json. Site cannot be reached. It's 5217. I don't know why I thought I could just remember all the different port numbers for my sample apps. It's not V1, it's internal.
If it was Aspire, you'd have a little dashboard to click on.
I know, right? This is how I should be thinking. Okay, here it is. I visited OpenAPI/internal. I get my internal document. If I hit public, I get my public document. Ta-da, very interesting. I could do this for an infinite number of documents. What this is powered by behind the scenes is there is this thing called the should default inclusion predicate. And this is the default value whenever you configure a new document. We will consider whether an endpoint should be included in the document that's being generated if it's got no group name. So if you don't define a group name that you belong to, you will be visible in all documents, or if your group name is equal to the document name. This is a standard inclusion predicate that all of the OpenAPI implementations in ASP.NET Core support. So NSWAG and Swashbuckle follow a similar predicate for how documents are grouped. It's based on the semantics of the API Explorer layer, which is the thing that powers all of these OpenAPI integrations behind the scenes. So this is kind of like the sensible default. It is customizable though. So if I jump back into the code, let's say that I didn't want to go through all of this business of adding group names to my endpoints, and I just wanted to be able to define my own inclusion predicate. Well, I can do that. Let me pop my define in and rerun my app as I talk a little bit about this. I can configure my own inclusion predicate. So here's one that I have defined that allows me to create a single document just for internal APIs. And I'm grouping them based on the relative path, whether or not it contains the string internal in it. And if I go ahead and jump back into my API, if I visit the internal JSON file by putting that document name in, I could see I get the same behavior, even though I promise it's a different app that's running. Since I don't have a public app configured anymore, I can see if I try and view the public one, we see that it's not found. Also, I just saw a tweet pass by. Somebody is roasting me for using regions and if defs. It works. I love it.
I was just going to call it out. It's beautiful. I think it's amazing.
I think it's great.
People get all worried about regions, and it's like, no, I mean, this is a great example of exactly what you want to collapse on.
The API description type is the one that is included in this should include predicate that I was showing earlier. This is actually a pre-existing type that's defined in the MVC API Explorer namespace. Don't ask me why it's in an MVC namespace, because I can go into like a very heartbroken rant about it, but that's where the type is defined. It gives you access to endpoint metadata. It gives you access to the method info that's associated with your endpoint handlers. And it gives you access to like rep values and parameters. So those are the kinds of things that you can derive inclusion predicates off of. It's pretty powerful. So you can kind of go wild with this if you'd like.
Okay. So you mentioned also the keyed services. So that's a good example that you were showing there, where you're able to, like, the keyed services is what allowed to call out the different, like, include this and include this as well, right?
Yep. So keyed services and named options mean that every document that you register has a completely separate, I think the most important thing is it has a completely separate schema store. And we'll talk about schemas in a little bit, but schemas are the representations of all of the types that are used in your API. With keyed DI, all of the schemas are stored independently of each other across documents. This comes off really helpful if you're maintaining multiple API versions. Each version is a separate document. And so each version has its own schema store, and you can keep different versions of your types and their schemas kind of isolated with each other.
Okay.
So yes, that's kind of a cool thing. Okay, I'm breezing through it because I'm trying to get through so much. It's interesting. You start talking about stuff and you realize there's so much to show. Cool. Transformers for customizations. There are two types of transformers that exist in your application: document transformers and operation transformers. Transformers are essentially functions or handlers that you can provide that you can use to mutate the document that is generated by the built-in support. So if we generate something and you're like, I don't like the way that title is generated, or actually, I need all of these endpoints to have this additional ambient parameter, maybe like an API version that you're getting from a header or something. You can use transformers to do this. It's not a novel concept. It exists in Swashbuckle and NSWAG as well. It's one of those things that's so like ubiquitously useful that it's everywhere, kind of like filters. You have action filters, endpoint filters. One thing to note about transformers is that they run in, first out order of registration. And we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like in a second. And that's really important because it allows you to build like a consistent mental model of how your document is being mutated and in what order things are running. So you can kind of be intentional about how you layer stuff. And the interface for document and operation transformers is pretty consistent between the two. Both of them implement support for async transformation functions. So they return a task and they take a cancellation token that you can use for any asynchronous calls you're making. They take in a context object, which you can use to access all sorts of useful things. And they allow you to access the OpenAPI document and the OpenAPI operation that are under modification. Cool. I want to talk a little bit about this OpenAPI document and OpenAPI operation type that you'll see. These are types that come from the Microsoft OpenAPI library. It's a library that's managed or developed by a team here at Microsoft, and it provides types for kind of representing the object model of OpenAPI in memory. So OpenAPIDocument and OpenAPIOperation come from that library. In the context of transformers, they are mutable, so you can directly modify them to make the customizations that you need to your file, or sorry, your document. The context types themselves give you access to the document name. If it's a document transformer, you get access to all of the API descriptions that are associated with that document. And if it's a single operation, you get access to the API description. So you can kind of get access to the raw metadata that is associated with that particular type. And then you get access to like application services. This is like an iService provider instance that you can query for stuff similar to what you would have in HTTP context. I mentioned they're registered as options that are in FIFO order. We have a couple of different registration APIs for them that we'll take a look at. Instance-based, delegate-based, and then ones that are activated. Operation transformers, as of now, can only be registered via a delegate. We don't have instance-based or APIs for registering them. That's something we're open to changing, though, so let us know if you are very keen to have different registration models for transformers. I'm going to pop into my code really quickly here. We're right at the finish time, but we're going to keep going. Okay, so here's what it looks like. I have a single document registered in my application, and I have 3 different kinds of transformers registered. I have an instance-based document transformer, an operation transformer, and then an activated document transformer. The info transformer just adds the contact info to my app. And then this bearer security one implements a pretty common pattern you'll see that was alluded to earlier, which is being able to add your security definitions to an OpenAPI document. So all of that is there. Let's really quickly run through that. I hope I'm not losing people because I'm talking really fast trying to fit in all this content.
Seeing this code makes a lot of what you were just talking about make sense to me.
Yeah, I'll just run this sample so you can kind of see these in effect.
We've got some good questions coming in too. So
awesome. So let me go ahead and visit the document. This will just be V1. And you can see the contact info has been applied. The summary that I added has been applied. And then I have my security scheme here because I have job bearer based auth configured in this app. So transformers do the transformer thing. And again, they run in order. So the bearer security scheme can see the info transformers modifications on the document. So you can kind of layer them that way. We did this intentionally because we wanted something that kind of mimicked the predictability of like filters and middleware in the order in which they run. So yeah.
Do the UI frameworks or whatever support those as well? Like those custom, I don't know, things that you're putting on like properties or?
They will. Most UI things will like respect the contact info and the UI that you attach. It'll see the final document after all the transformations have been applied. So generally, if it's true to the OpenAPI spec, it'll handle all of the things that are in the document. Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's really useful. The transformers, they almost feel, so you mentioned filters and stuff. They almost feel kind of like filters, I guess.
Yeah, transformers, filters in disguise.
They're very nice. Okay. You're going to be shocked to hear there were tons of transformer jokes going on.
So it's funny. When we were doing API review, originally these were called filters because I actually like the name filters because I think it follows like filters, action filters, endpoint filters. But they're not technically filters because they do mutate the state that they're interacting with. And so we were like trying to figure out what name should we use. And then we were in API review, and I pulled up thesaurus.com, and I think I looked up like filter or change or something. And then transform was one of the synonyms for change. It's like transformers.
Okay.
So that's how that came to be. Okay. I have miscellaneous info bits to talk about. What versions of the OpenAPI spec are supported? We support OpenAPI v2, aka Swagger. So the OG version, it's like 10 years old now, but it's supported. And OpenAPI v3, which is probably what most people are using. We do not yet support OpenAPI 3.1. I know it's sad, but the reason is that the OpenAPI version that we are able to support is limited by the version of the Microsoft OpenAPI library that we're using. So I mentioned earlier, that's the library that kind of provides the in-memory data model for the spec. They actually do have a version of it for 3.1, and I've done some prototyping with it. It's not going to be released in time, though. So for .NET 9, we are not going to support 3.1. Hopefully, we will in the future as the new version of the Microsoft OpenAPI package comes out.
Is there anything substantially different in 3.1?
Oh my gosh, yes. The biggest thing is like around schemas, actually. So we'll get into this a little bit later on, but there is kind of a little bit of a distinction between OpenAPI JSON schemas and true JSON schemas. And one of the things that the specification has been working on is unifying those a little bit. So the big delta that's made in 3.1 is the schemas that are represented in OpenAPI are a lot closer to what JSON schema specification requires. That's like the big one.
And then you've mentioned that Microsoft.OpenAPI package. Is that related to the Kyoto work? Is that like a similar team or something?
Yeah, it's the same team, actually. Okay. Yeah, the same team that makes the package also makes Kyoto. So
okay, makes sense.
So and Gerald Miller, who's a fantastic person, and a collaborator of ours, he is actually on the OpenAPI specification board. So it's really cool to have somebody who's working on the spec and the implementation of the spec in both client generation and also like the in-memory representation.
That made me happy when I first heard about Kyoto and I saw Daryl's name and I'm like, okay, this is going to be good.
We know the person.
Yeah.
Yes.
Cool.
Cool. What about Microsoft ASP.NET Core OpenAPI 8.0 and prior to? Okay. So if you keep up to date with things, you might know that this like Microsoft ASP.NET Core OpenAPI package is not new. It came out in .NET 7. And one of the things that it came out with in .NET 7 is this with OpenAPI extension method that you could call, and it was just for minimal APIs. And what it did is it opted you into built-in OpenAPI generation for a single endpoint. So we weren't generating the entire document like we are now. It was just for a single endpoint. And then we had written some logic and swashbuckle to like union the OpenAPI operation we would generate with the ones that swashbuckle was building in its document. What is happening?
I first saw that with the OpenAPI or the minimal API scaffolding.
Yes.
That it was adding that.
Yes. Cool. What is happening with this extension method moving forward? Nothing. There is an issue on the swashbuckle repo where we had a discussion about kind of what to do with it moving forward. And the conclusion would be that this API would not take in the new world. So moving forward in .NET 9 and beyond, if you're using built-in code gen, you probably shouldn't be calling with OpenAPI. If you're using 8.0 and prior and you're working with swashbuckle and you have been using it, you can continue to do so. But this is kind of an API that we're keeping, but not bringing forward into the new universe. It is what it is.
So if I do use it, is it going to hurt anything, or is it just not really necessary?
It's not necessary. The built-in OpenAPI document generation is not going to look at it. So if you call it and you notice that the stuff you're doing in it is not applying in your actual generated document, nothing's happening. It really only works with Swashbuckle at this point.
Got it. Okay.
Yep. Cool. Okay. This is when I was going to do an architecture overview, but I am going to skip it and just say, read the blog post. One of the things I really wanted to show here, and maybe I'll just geek out for a bit and show it.
Yeah, you can. I mean, we can take a good 10, 15 more minutes if you're free. I mean,
yeah.
So
this is so great. I get to hold people prisoner and talk about OpenAPI. I'm living my dream. Okay, this is a mermaid diagram I made. I've been referencing it a lot because I think it does a really good job of showing the layers that are involved in getting this like OpenAPI support working. It walks you through starting from just the controller-based API or the minimal API on the left to moving through the API Explorer layer in the middle, and then the consumers of API Explorer metadata at the far right. If you want to understand all of the different parts of this flow diagram, I strongly recommend you check out the blog post that John mentioned earlier. And it talks a little bit about all of these different components do, some of the like implementation quirks associated with them, et cetera, et cetera.
I like the optimism of Fool Snabble here saying that must mean there are 9 teams working on this, and I'm going to guess there's Safia working.
There is one Safia.
Yes. Nice.
Very cool. Okay, so let's talk about the fun stuff. Let's talk about JSON schema. Okay, so we alluded to this a little bit earlier when we were talking about v3.1 support, which is that there is a distinction between JSON schemas that are used in OpenAPI and JSON schemas as they are in the specification. The JSON schema specification is actually in draft mode. It's not an officially adopted specification. I think it's like on the 6th or 7th draft or something to that effect. So it hasn't been fully adopted. It's still evolving. And then as of OpenAPI v3, there are distinctions in the way things are represented. The way the type is represented is different. Polymorphic types are totally different between OpenAPI schema in v3 and JSON schema. OpenAPI supports things out of the box around kind of basically what are validation attributes that JSON schema treats as extensions. So there's differences between the two. A lot of the infrastructure and the built-in OpenAPI document generation is massaging those differences. Why do we have to massage them? It's because we are building the schema support in the OpenAPI document using the JSON schema generation support that is coming to system text JSON. So there has been like an issue filed on system text JSON to add JSON schema support for a while. And I've been like super excited about it because it'll help me with this OpenAPI stuff. And it's finally happening in .NET 9, which is super cool. But some of the API shapes are going to be a little bit fluid, especially as we account for the fact that the JSON schema specification is still in draft mode and subject to evolution. And so what it essentially looks like, if you look at the code underneath the hood, is we call into system text JSON to generate schemas for a given .NET type. System text JSON gives us back an opaque JSON object with the schema. We then have this custom OpenAPI JSON schema type that takes the JSON object and maps it to an OpenAPI schema, which is how it's actually represented in the OpenAPI document. And as part of these transformations, we do things like add support for like the discriminator properties that OpenAPI expects for polymorphic types. We add support for validation attributes and route constraints, like all of the stuff that system text JSON is not generating by default in its schemas. So we go on a little bit of journey with schemas here. This is a space that's like most evolving in the implementation at the moment. But I think we're going to land on an interesting, like a really good place, especially when we have JSON schema support in system text JSON, which I'm super excited about. So I wanted to show a little bit of a couple of demos, and maybe we could jump through them really quickly of just some of the different scenarios that are supported. So route constraints and validation attributes. The system text JSON implementation of JSON schema is not going to respect route constraints and validation attributes because they're not considered like core to the JSON object model itself. They're kind of materialized at the binding layer of ASP.NET Core. So it's up to ASP.NET Core to add all of this information to the generated schemas. And so if I jump into my code sample, okay, and I have constraints and validations, pop that in, and I'm gonna run it behind the scenes. Oh my gosh, this is embarrassing. I have a floating semicolon. I wonder if it'll be fine. I think it might be fine because it'll just be we'll see. Okay, yep, it's fine because it's just a empty statement. Okay, cool. So I have two endpoints. One of them takes a route parameter that has some route constraints, and then another has a bunch of attributes on it from system component model. And if I go ahead and pop into my generated file, we'll see that those route constraints surface in the schema, min length and max length. And then also I get things like my description attribute and my minimum and maximum, my range constraints represented in the integer as well. So cool, that's fun. Nothing super special, I think, but that's because there's way more interesting things to look at. I guess the next thing is, let me remove is enums. So enums are interesting in the sense that if you have the JSON string enum converter enabled on an enum type, then we will respect that in the representation of the schema that is produced. And this is really something that system text JSON is doing for us when it generates the JSON schema, because it kind of knows what converters are registered on a particular type. So we don't have to interrogate that at all. And I think this is what's kind of cool about the fact that our OpenAPI schema implementation builds on JSON schema and system text JSON, is a lot of these, like, you get a more faithful representation of how JSON, system text JSON is actually binding things.
Nice. Okay.
So yeah, you get, gosh, what am I trying to show? Yeah, my enum, my clothing type enum is represented as an actual enum property, shirts, pants, shoes. My query, my clothing size enum, is just an integer because it has no JSON string converter that is associated with it. So when you're actually binding it, we're not binding from a string, we're just binding from the numerical value.
Nice. Okay.
Cool. Other interesting things. Forms is an interesting one. So forms are interesting because forms are can be bound from the URL or the request body, but forms can materialize in multiple ways, in multiple arguments in the same document. So if I show you this forms example here, I have an endpoint that takes an iForm file and something that's bound from a form, like a to-do. And if we take a look at the spec for this, we see that we're using all of to indicate that it's multiple parameters being sourced from the same form data. So all of is kind of like a union type of sorts. This schema is the representation of binary input, so file upload. This is my image that I was requesting be uploaded. And then we have a separate schema for the actual to-do object that is going to need to be bound. Cool. And then the other thing is polymorphic types. And I think for this one, I'm actually going to jump into my separate sample where I'm actually pulling in dev bits from my local branch of.
Exciting.
Yeah. So this is like, I'm doing it live. I'm working on this right now. And so if we go ahead and run this, I can show you my example, and I'm making you dizzy by scrolling so fast. But say I have a set of polymorphic types that are annotated with the JSON derived type attribute. I have a shape with an annotation for a triangle and a square, and I have an API that takes it. If I jump in and I view the generated OpenAPI file, this is what I would get. One of the things you'll see is that we're actually making use of the ref keyword in the JSON schema specification, which is a way to reference OpenAPI documents across files. So we use one of to denote that the document generated can be either one of these types. And then this discriminator property is unique to OpenAPI schema. So when I talked about the differences between OpenAPI and JSON schema, this is one of them. OpenAPI expects you to provide things like the type discriminator property name, so $type as one of the arguments, and then you want to provide the mappings yourself. So triangle is a discriminated triangle, square is a discriminated square. This type name here is kind of work in progress. But the distinction is that a triangle that's being referenced in a polymorphic type has to provide the type argument, and it usually has a single value, which is just the discriminator name. Can I go on a rant about one of the things that makes, sorry, this is so.
Sure, go off.
It's not a rant. It's just, you'll see this and you'll be like, Safia, what are you doing? And I'll be like, I have good reason for it. So type is the discriminator type that OpenAPI, or sorry, JSON schema will use to disambiguate between the two derived types during binding. When you're a triangle, it's only one value. It's a const triangle. But OpenAPI schema does not have the concept of consts, like a constant value for a property. Okay. So the workaround for that is if I want to say that something can only have a single value, that's some string, I have to provide it as an enum with a single value. So if you see that, that's why there's some quirks you have to work around. But yes, that's polymorphic types.
One question. We've got a stack of questions, but a few people are asking how these polymorphic types work with UIs, like Scalar or
UIs handle it pretty well. So I know Swagger UI has pretty good handling for this. Scalar UI will present it, although I think there were some settings to make it a little bit better. I haven't tested it with client generators like NSWAG yet, but that's on my to-do list.
Cool.
This is everything else that's on my to-do list. Schema refs, we saw a little bit of that with the polymorphic types. It also comes into play with recursive types. Schema transformers are going to be a thing. There are some interesting things to sort out there with regards to when schema transformers run, especially when we want to support customization at the system text JSON schema generation layer. XML doc comment support. It's one of the most upvoted, or in top 10, 15 most upvoted issues on the GitHub repo. Ecosystem integrations. Some of the stuff works good-ish. ASP.NET versioning and swag, etc. Just testing all the things. please give recommendations for stuff you want verification on. We talked about improving the build time generation experience, and then also, OpenAPI is a spec, it evolves. There's like OpenAPI Moonwalk /v4 that's out there. So kind of having a future looking perspective on how we evolve with the spec with this built-in support.
Wow.
I'm done.
Okay.
That was fun.
I just want to call out that you gave me some extra canned questions in case we didn't get any questions and we went short. So that is awesome. I started 12 questions here. We went pretty long. Do you want to, like, you can look in StreamYard and see if any of these look good to you? Or if you're done, that's fine too.
Okay. We have this converter enabled. I think there's some good stuff about generics. I'll have to make sure that we test that well. There's some stuff about like Scalar and Swagger and what kinds of things they support. I would recommend going to their docs directly for kind of what aspects of the spec they represent faithfully. We talked about polymorphic types and NSWAG. Yeah. One thing to note here is I know that sometimes some OpenAPI implementations expect things to have a certain shape, and that shape is not necessarily always true to the spec. So one of the principles of this implementation is always prioritize the spec. If the OpenAPI spec says that polymorphic types should be represented with the discriminator and this property mapping, that's what we will do. And I think it's being faithful to the spec as opposed to a tool might expect things to have a certain shape and it needs to be massaged that way. So I know that's a very principled stance, but I think it's the one that'll help us go further with stuff. Do they support
question? Fowler's asking, what about extensions? I'm not sure.
I don't know. I think, is he talking about C#13 extensions? I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure what he means there. I'm guessing yes.
Yeah, I think he saw discriminator
or
discriminated, and he got really excited. That's a very spicy word to use.
Yeah.
Extensions for OpenAPI. If you're talking about, so OpenAPI does support arbitrary properties in an operation. So you can have things like x dash blah, 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 and give it whatever value you want, and it'll be materialized in your document. That's supported via transformers. So you can use that to add auxiliary metadata to your OpenAPI document. I know things like Power BI and certain like Power Apps integrations expect extension metadata. So yeah, that is available. That's provided by the Microsoft OpenAPI object model and transformers.
Okay. Let me grab just a few quick questions. Some of these I think will be just like, yes, no kind of things, but support for generating YAML instead of JSON.
Ooh, good question. It's only JSON at the moment. Somebody actually bought it up when we were first doing this work. YAML is pretty easy to add. It's just a flag that we would have to pass through. If you're really excited about this, please file an issue. And if other people are really excited, please upvote it. And that gives me signal that it's worth spending however long to add it to the implementation. So cool. No, but possible.
Okay. How can we be sure the implementation matches OpenAPI spec? For example, it's not unusual for the spec to say we only return 200 and 500, but then a clever dev returns a 201.
Okay. So this one's kind of interesting because at least as far as things go with this implementation, it's a code first based implementation. That means we look at the API that's implemented and we generate an OpenAPI document that reflects that. It's not spec first in the sense that we're looking for a specification that denotes certain things, and then the API might not be faithful to that spec. So we don't do anything with regards to spec first approach in our implementation. If you are doing things right with regard to like using produces annotations correctly, using typed results, the generated OpenAPI document should be a faithful representation of what your API actually does. But spec first is kind of a bit of a Wild West right now.
Okay. Question about whether OpenAPI features will be included in the Aspire templates.
I think so. I will look into that. One thing I can say is that eShop is being updated. That's kind of like our canonical modern sample app is being updated to have the new stuff built in. Also, the web API templates are now updated to use this built-in support. So it's kind of trickling through the templates. I'll have to look if the Aspire templates have a web API in particular.
Okay.
I'm telling on myself a little bit, but I don't know that.
Is there a way to get all the keys or document names in an app?
Oh my gosh, that's a good question. Okay, I talked a little bit about how this is built on KeyDI a ton. There is actually not really a great way with KeyDI to get all of the service keys that are associated with a particular type. I have filed an issue on the GitHub repo for the runtime to add support for this API, and I'm using a bit of a workaround in the implementation at the moment to do it. So out of the box, there's not really a super nice way. There is an iDocument provider interface that's implemented that allows you to get all document names, although it's a internal interface at the moment, so you'd have to use private reflection to get at it. So no, but I'm curious to know why you would like that and if we can make it better.
So they had another comment on there saying they're building a library or something, and that would be useful for that. So I
Ooh, okay, very exciting. Yes, I think I've been talking a lot about people who are using this in like apps. But if you're building an API or a library on top of this, let me know if there's anything that you're curious about. And I'll see, because I think making this nice for library consumers, like .NET library consumers, is definitely a goal too.
Okay. All right. We have a few good questions from Fool Snabble. So building large documents, I mentioned before, so a question here about, can they generate a base during build time and then run transformers at runtime? I'm thinking no from what you show.
Yeah, I want to understand a little bit what you mean by base, but no. And actually, when you generate it at build time, what you're getting is the document with the transformers. So yeah, I'm curious to know, do you mean that the document that's generated at build time is like source generated, or that we read from it at runtime and then apply transformations on it? I think I kind of get what you're getting at, but I want to know more details. But based on my understanding, it's not possible at the moment.
There's a follow-up question from the person that wanted to do the introspection. Where's the best place to communicate? Would it be just file an issue, or
file an issue on the GitHub page for ASP.NET Core. We can paste the link for that in the chat. I'm on Twitter too, Captain Safia, but I also look at GitHub issues fairly regularly.
Cool. Okay. Questions about, sorry to keep going, but there's a lot of great questions here. There's OpenAPI doc, open in prod. So the question here was like, we talked about, you don't want to have the UI turned on by default, but then the doc basically exposes the UI. So what are your thoughts on exposing the OpenAPI spec or the doc in prod?
So sometimes it's totally valid to have the OpenAPI spec up in prod, like just the JSON that's generated. There are some tools that expect this, like Azure API Management does have a feature where you can point to add an OpenAPI JSON like running on an app. I think like OpenAI also has a thing where you can point OpenAI at an OpenAPI JSON file. So the risks really with the UI come from like web-based threats, like cross-site scripting attacks that people could implement. things where you are leaking OAuth config specifically in the UI, not in the document. So that's where the UI specific threats come in. The spec itself is like fairly inert with the kinds of things that it represents. The big risk there, though, is information disclosure. You want to be careful that you're not, if you don't want a certain endpoint documented to the public, you can exclude it from your document. And there are docs that show how to do that. But it's a different set of risks when you have a web UI that anybody can access and send arbitrary requests to your backend versus a static like JSON document.
Okay. All right. Narrowing down, I think just a couple more questions here. So we talked about OpenAPI UI. And so then they're saying like, well, when's it going to be included in the templates? Otherwise, this is a downgrade for tutorials and that sort of stuff. So I believe it's still available. It's just, it's only the template. Basically, we only want to show it in dev, right? Or is this saying in the newer tutorials?
Yeah, it's not in the templates.
Newer templates.
We're exploring doing stuff like in tooling to enhance this experience. Like the Endpoints Explorer is a thing in Visual Studio. So kind of like developer-based or dev time-based tooling to help with this. I totally feel you that it is a bit of a break for people who are like doing the file new template experience pretty regularly. But I think a combination of tooling experiences that fill the gap. And then I think just the fact that we have the ecosystem of packages that are like download a package, install it, download a package, enable it, helps with this.
Okay, cool. One other question is versioning. I forget, is versioning expected in .NET 9?
Versioning support like out of the box is not expected. ASP.NET versioning is the library that people use canonically for this kind of stuff. And I'm actively looking at making sure the integration with ASP.NET versioning and OpenAPI is sharp for .NET 9. I think I saw a question. Versioning in this context is API versioning. So being able to evolve different versions of your API as you add endpoints or change data models is versioning.
Cool. Okay. Well, I think this is a huge amount of info. Let me wrap up just by sharing. I have your repo.
Yes.
So this is the repo we shared. This is in the links, and I'm also going to share it in the comments here. So this is awesome. I appreciate that. And then also you've got your deep dive blog post that goes through this stuff too.
Yeah. Check out the blog post. And one last link, I didn't share this with you earlier, John, but there's also the new docs page. Oh yeah, there it is. Oh my gosh, you're so on top of it. Oh wait, this is my screen.
I switched your screen. That's how I'm on top of it.
I'm on top of it. But this is the new docs page. This has been a little bit of like a labor of love for me over the past couple of weeks. I've been trying to add as much content and code samples as possible. I've optimized for having stuff that's really copy pastable. So don't just copy paste straight from the docs, but if you do, it should work.
Okay.
But yes, cool. And then there's some like third-party integrations that are in out here. So yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Wow. Thanks. That was a huge amount of stuff. Earlier when we were talking, I'm like, OpenAPI, how much can there be to cover? And wow, apparently there's quite a bit.
We barely scratched the surface. I could be here for like 3 more hours talking about
Okay, let's do it. Okay, well, so this is great. Let's get another one scheduled and go deeper on stuff. And then folks watching, leave your comments on stuff you'd like to know more about, and we'll go deeper. So
yeah, if people are interested in a session that is just how stuff works under the hood, we could do that. That might be fun.
Awesome. Okay.
Cool.
Thanks so much, Safia. Thanks for all our viewers. We had a ton of. I was wondering after a holiday weekend how many people would watch, and apparently it was quite a few. So that's awesome.
I know. OpenAPI people. There are like millions of us.
Dozens, literally.
Yeah, dozens.
Awesome. Okay. Thanks so much, everybody.
All right. Bye.